Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is a notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
Hi, I'm Michael, Senior Intelligence Analyst at Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias. And in today's episode, we're very honored to have a returning guest to us to talk about the situation in China and Taiwan. And more specifically, for the interest of this episode, we're going to do basically a war game episode in which we're going to lay out a couple of scenarios of how China might plan to try to seize Taiwan from a military component. We'll be analyzing different scenarios such as a military blockade, seizing the outer island, or directly launching a massive invasion into Taiwan proper under the construct and guidance that Xi Jinping has laid out to the PLA that he wants to have the military capabilities by 2027 to launch such an operation. And so for the exercise of this episode, we are going to assume that it is 2027 and that Xi Jinping has given that order in those different courses of actions that I've laid out. And for this episode, our returning guest is Ben Lewis. Ben Lewis is a defense analyst who focuses on PLA development and on Taiwan security issues. He's also the founder of PLA Tracker, a phenomenal site that I recommend all our listeners and viewers to check out. And with that, Ben, thank you so much for joining us again at the Bottom Line Up Front.
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, looking forward to our discussion.
Well, Ben, we're going to go with that. And I think, there's a lot of situations in the geopolitical construct that we look at the Asia Pacific. And I just might give a quick intro before we go to our war game. I mean, obviously, the big issues is the elections in Japan, where we saw just a resounding victory of the current prime minister and her ability to kind of stay in power. She has an absolute majority. I mean, a historic majority. This is the first time since the end of World War II where you've seen a political party have such a dominant role within the Japanese parliament, to just a point that they can unilaterally change the constitution. And I think the number one aspect that they will change is kind of this, a lot of analysts and policy think minds and people who focus on Japan think of is, kind of Japan's removing a lot of these limitations that they have in the constitution for the military. And I think that's a major development. Obviously, China has been trying to play hardball against Japan, trying to see if, saber rattling and threatening military actions against Japan might get the electorate in Japan to back off from supporting the current prime minister. And clearly that has failed. The Japanese government now has basically stated that the situation of Taiwan is of national security interest of Japan. Which is a very interesting development and kind of indicates that from at least the Japanese perspective, what we're looking at is that if China launches a military offensive in Taiwan or certain one of these courses of actions lay out, that more than likely Japan will get involved militarily to try to stop that, because right now under the current prime minister, Japan views the situation of Taiwan as a primary national security interest and geopolitical interest of Japan. Another interesting development is obviously Hong Kong. Pro-opposition figures have been detained and condemned and for over 20 years in prison. Basically, all elements of the pro-democracy movement inside of Hong Kong have been absolutely quashed. And the interesting aspect, though, I think, is that because of the situation in Hong Kong and how this two-system, one-country model wasn't sustainable, as Xi Jinping's rise in authoritarianism doesn't allow anybody other than his own preferred governance to kind of continue squashed any semblance of autonomy or self-governance for Hong Kong. I think it's fair to assume that anybody in Taiwan, even the KMT, who might be the nationalists, a little bit more inclined to have better relations with China, obviously are going to probably take a step back and not view any situation with that form of governance as being favorable to Taiwan. And so with those two kind of contracts going on, we're going to kind of jump ahead and pretend that this is 2027 and analyzes the three courses of actions that I've laid out. And the first one, I think, before we record, how I laid it out is from a Chinese perspective, I would consider a low risk, low reward, which is basically China declares a quarantine or a blockade against Taiwan. And the interesting scenario is we actually have a modern precedent right now in how China might try to do this. And that is how President Trump did it against Venezuela and now against Cuba. in which they basically declared a quarantine, a blockade against Venezuela and now Cuba. We've seen the United States seize tankers around the world. Just today, actually, an oil tanker was seized in the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-PACOM AOR that was kind of accused of violating the sanctions and all of these kind of operating in the shadow fleet. And the United States seized it. There's been dozens of oil tankers that have been seized by the United States. And I think with under that mindset, there is a possibility, a scenario that maybe China decides to do something similar. Let's say if Xi Jinping orders the military takeover to Taiwan, takes a low risk, low reward with saying, okay, we're going to institute a blockade and a quarantine. And so with that first course of action laid out, Ben, let me ask you this. One, how do you envision the PLA Navy specifically launching this type of operation? And two, I guess the fundamental question is, as we know that the Chinese Navy has been trying to expand their Blue Navy capability, the question is, do they have the capabilities to institute basically a 24/7 blockade around Taiwan physically, or would it be much more, let's say, politically with the threat, and they wouldn't necessarily need the actual vessels around Taiwan to institute this blockade? So, Ben, I'll push it on to you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And the blockade scenario is something that's been discussed a lot in recent years. I think there's a couple ways to look at this. First, in terms of the PLAN's capacity to execute some kind of blockade or quarantine, I think they're just about there. And I say that largely because it won't just be them. What we've seen in the last year and a half with Joint Sword 2024 A and B, and then really Justice Mission 2025, it will be a joint operation involving not only the PLA Navy, but also Chinese maritime law enforcement. So that's the China Coast Guard, Maritime Safety Administration, other maritime law enforcement agencies that are under the CCG. They did a massive overhaul of the organization in the mid 2010s. So they've demonstrated their ability to not only adopt a proto blockade or quarantine posture, but also to integrate military and non-military or paramilitary or law enforcement entities under this operational kind of umbrella of, okay, we're enforcing a blockade or quarantine around Taiwan. So together, coupled together, I think their maritime forces are pretty much there. They've worked really hard to get there, and I think what we've seen with the big named exercises in the last year and a half is they are really taking this integration seriously. And to your point, there's also the threat. I mean, it's the shipping insurance rates could really decide the whole thing. What we've seen in the past is during exercises, ships have avoided visiting ports in Taiwan because the shipping insurance rates just skyrocket astronomically, or the potential miscalculation associated with a major exercise is just too risky for a ship to go to. So in a real enforced blockade scenario, those calculations for shipping companies become much more acute. That said, I think it's very likely that, given Taiwan's, crucial role in global supply chains with its semiconductor manufacturing, the money is still going to be good enough for some people to go in. So there would probably still need to be a semi physical presence enforcing the blockade. And I think combined together, the PLA Navy, Chinese maritime law enforcement, obviously the PLA's extensive air capabilities are in a pretty good position to do that. To your point, Stefano, it's low risk as these things go, low reward. There's no guarantee that you get what you want out of it. And it's the viability of the option relative to a full-scale invasion, joint island landing campaign, or a high-intensity kind of joint firepower strike campaign to compel Taiwan to sign some kind of agreement under threat of just constant bombardment. Those may be more appealing to Beijing because it's very difficult to, force a country under blockade to basically sign away its sovereignty, especially given, as you mentioned in Hong Kong, the one country, two systems model, which was originally proposed by Deng Xiaoping, is really not viable for, from the perspective of most people, because we've all seen how it went with Hong Kong, and people in Taiwan have paid very close attention to that.
And I think in this case, if you look at the 2005 anti-secession law, that basically from Beijing's perspective, gave them the right to use force in any area that they claim authority over if they believe that secession is occurring. And that's kind of like what you've seen in Hong Kong and in Beijing. They believe that Taiwan is theirs. And so what we've seen since then is like in 2021, Chinese Coast Guard was empowered via a law to take necessary measures, including force. In maritime areas that they believe are in their jurisdiction. So that includes sort of the nine dash line or the cow tongue. And then more recently, we saw Order Number Three, which has expanded those powers. And that is really where I think you would see at least the initial enforcement of that quarantine. And they could probably bring in some of the assets that the PLAN has at their disposal to help enforce that. And so it's a measure of lawfare that China is engaging in here.
So actually, but let me, because it's funny, I said the PLN Navy, and I love how kind of like, Ben, you highlighted the Coast Guard, and Matt, you were kind of saying that as well in the comments section. But let me provide a counterpoint, if I may, from a war game perspective. Taiwan is in Venezuela, right? There is a fundamental risk from a military component, because in the end of the day, a blockade of this nature and this magnitude against Taiwan is a named military operation, would have to inherently be led by a joint command within the Eastern Theater Command, more than likely, right? And if you're going to, now, I can understand the argument that you can have the Coast Guard in coordination with the Navy. My concern is, though, you're running into a situation where these Coast Guard vessels are sitting ducks in comparison to the Taiwanese A2AD capabilities. We know Taiwan has extensive anti-ship capabilities, both from not only a mining perspective, but from an anti-ship missile capability. That is something that they've been really fundamentally focusing on more than anything else, right? And the United States is trying to enhance this kind of the construct of Taiwan being a porcupine. I mean, the irony, right? If you look at China, their whole construct from the last couple of years or last decade from a military doctrine perspective has been to enhance A2AD against the United States. But those capabilities don't inherently work for a Taiwan scenario. You need those conventional capabilities. So now Taiwan, to mitigate that, is A2AD. And so my concern is if we're talking about the Coast Guard being employed significantly in an operation like this as in a blockade, you run the risk of your vessels basically being sitting ducks against Taiwanese A2AD, because Chinese Coast Guard vessels are not, built in a way to frame and operate anti-ship capability. And that's why I focus much more on the PLN Navy perspective, because just as we saw, even with the scenario of Venezuela, which has minimal capabilities compared to Taiwan, almost non-existent capabilities, it was a U.S. Navy-led operation. And I think this would have to have not only a significant PLA Navy component, but almost wholeheartedly PLA Navy component, because you're no longer operating in gray zone with a blockade. It's no longer gray zone. And the Taiwan, you're invading the Taiwanese to respond. And I don't know how much the Chinese public, although it might, galvanize and spur movement, would tolerate significant casualties within the Coast Guard or even the maritime, militia. I think there's a lot of risk, and that's why I've been focusing much more on the Navy and the Blue Fleet than anything else.
So I think, the Farsi Defense Fleet, the Blue Water Navy that they've been building is very important, and that would be there to back it up. But the way I look at this would be an opening salvo designed to sort of force commercial compliance before Taiwan's allies have a chance to coordinate a response. And then it pushes sort of the onus for that next move onto Taiwan and its allies if they want to break that quarantine, not necessarily a blockade. And then Beijing would then go to the international stage, just kind of claiming that it is just enforcing its domestic law. And there are probably people within that sphere that would buy that or support that. But Michael?
I really do feel like I had to echo kind of the same idea that Stefano was having here, and I very much agree with it, is that the idea of the low stakes, low reward kind of approach in a blockade doesn't really apply to the same kind of standards that we saw in, Venezuela. given that Taiwan's ability to respond and given a blockade is really just opening up Taiwan's ability to respond, that it's onto their points. And whether or not, this opens up to the next possibility of how China is going to respond, Matt, just as you explained, it's like they could take this to the international stage. That I think kind of eliminates it. This is no longer a low stakes. It's definitely coming at it's definitely coming at the expense of that China is going to have to expel, not only to risk its own, Coast Guard and sea capabilities, but also have to expand its own international standings for what I think they feel like a good chunk of the world. While they definitely would have their supporters, I feel like a good chunk of the world would see this for what it is.
I think the difficulty in comparing what we saw with Venezuela and what we saw here is, because of how China frames the Taiwan issue as an internal issue, there is an almost a requirement for deep integration of maritime law enforcement into this kind of operation because of its nature. That's not to say the PLAN won't be integral, which it absolutely will be. And I think, the kind of wild card is if you enforce a blockade, right, you invite Taiwan to fire the first shot, essentially, of a conflict. If you're hoping to frame Taiwan as the escalatory actor in this situation, there's really no better way to do that than to basically bait them into firing at you first. And so those two components, I think, really are what drives the maritime law enforcement component. And I think what we've seen with Joint Sword 2024A, B, Straight Thunder 2025 to a lesser extent, but then Justice Mission 2025 is very deep integration by specifically China Coast Guard, CCG, but also Maritime Safety Administration in a more supporting role um, into this kind of blockade posture. Um, Additionally, when you're talking about the calculus of how you maintain a blockade, especially if there is, outside intervention from the United States or its allies and partners, the PLAN is going to have its plate pretty full, dealing with not only Taiwan's anti-ship missile capabilities, but also counter-intervention. This is a core component of what the PLAN has been working to develop in the last decade and a half. Is how do we simultaneously control the Taiwan area, so lock down the strait, lock down the area around Taiwan to its north, south, and east, but also to prepare for potentially a very high intensity attempt to break through a blockade by the United States Navy. And so I think when you take that into account, offloading some of the work of actually enforcing a blockade for civilian vessels to maritime law enforcement is really the most practical way to do it. You can't dedicate, destroyers to, boarding and searching cargo vessels. That's the China Coast Guard's job. While the PLAN is, potentially conducting high intensity combat operations, either against the United States or against Taiwan, or both. So I think that really is, from my perspective, what is driving this decision to really work to integrate these forces. And I think they have made a lot of progress in doing so. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are really hoping to accomplish a full integration for this scenario where everyone will play an important role. And obviously, the PLAN is going to do what the PLAN is built to do, which is fight war. But the China Coast Guard will have a very important role in that as well, I think.
I mean,
And
if I may just jump in though, because I think where me and Michael are coming from this, from a war game perspective, right? And is this idea that okay, you institute a blockade and then Taiwan fires the first shot. Well, not the fires the first shot after the blockade, and this idea that well, then China plays the victim. Like, I think we need to have an honest and like there's this idea that somehow in this scenario like people are going to look at that and think that Taiwan is the necessarily as, and I think that's a wrong thing to kind of analyze this from, right? Because number one, even if you claim Taiwan is an internal issue, right? If you're going to use the international law from a perspective, right? UNCLOS makes it abundantly clear that Taiwan does not have this ability to do that, right? From a rite of passage type of for maritime vessels, right? They would be inherently. I mean, that's the argument that Venezuela had. The difference is that who is going to challenge the United States Navy in Venezuela? So if Venezuela launched a response, a military response, I mean, yeah, you're just inviting the United States to conduct a retaliation, but it's not from a perspective of, well, the U.S. arguments against Venezuela was the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro, not the legality of the blockade. It was just the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro from the perspective. I think equating the United States and China, when in the end of the day, it doesn't matter what Russia thinks. What really matters is what the United States, the European Union, and more importantly, Japan thinks in this construct. And I think the question is if Taiwan were to respond militarily against the Coast Guard, because I like how you framed it, Ben, in which it's almost like, if I may, it's kind of how you're framing this, that you have this inner corridor around Taiwan, which would be the Chinese Coast Guard, and the PLA Navy is kind of this outer corridor to prevent any blockades, right? But my question with that is, if you're running into a scenario where the United States is trying to break the blockade, and at the same time Taiwan responds militarily to the inside of the blockade, we're running into the reason why we framed it low risk, low reward is because it's a low risk type of operation where you can try to assert yourself into the good, but the low reward is because it has very low chance of succeeding. Right? It has a very low chance of succeeding. And if this actually goes kinetic, the PLA better have a substantial amount of forces on standby ready to go to the next stage of the operation, which could be the next course of action that we talk about. I just think putting the blame on Taiwan for responding militarily from an international perspective, the question is who in the international community is going to listen to China? And okay, we can talk about the global south, but in the end of the day, let's be absolutely realistic here. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. But let me go to okay, go ahead.
Stefano, just quickly, when I was framing this as it's not necessarily international law that I'm looking at. It is internal. It is the CCP, and being able to create a framework, a legal framework within the PRC to support mobilization, requisition, and potentially creating maritime and air exclusion zones. So that I'm not necessarily talking about them directly going to their partners, but this would be the legal framework that they would use themselves. And I don't necessarily agree that like they will go for this low risk, low reward approach, but through that framework, I think the most important thing, as you were saying, is having the PLAN there ready and able to back them up, and this would give them some of that justification, while also creating potentially a wedge among some of Taiwan's allies. That's my perspective, Ben.
So let me actually, Ben, let me ask you this question then. And you have by all means address because you have your hand up and I want you to. But is the way I framed it, because you track this much more than we do, right? Based on your observation in the exercise and what's publicly available, but what I'm very fascinated is the way I framed it correct? In other words, you would have the Chinese Coast Guard kind of doing that, if I may, inner blockade immediately around Taiwan, and then you would have the PLA Navy in the outside enforcing the blockade and making sure the United States Navy, Japan, Australia, or is it much more complicated? Is it different? Is there a possibility that the PLA Navy might actually escort these Coast Guard vessels to provide that additional protection? Like, what have you seen in these exercises that gives us a leeway about how would this tactically be done?
I think it's a very complicated combination of those things. So it's what we've seen in the exercises is joint PLA, Navy, China Coast Guard operations, and then also separate, kind of under the same operational umbrella, but kind of concurrent operations doing, testing different concepts, and the ability to respond if something goes wrong in one place and how do you adjust. Just to circle back on the previous point about the framing, I think it's very important to note that like for China, the framing of this, however it goes, will be one of the most important components. They work tirelessly to frame this as an internal issue that, they reject external interference. They position the Democratic Progressive Party, which is currently, latching to the president of Taiwan, as kind of an upstart, provocative party that's pro-independence, it's secessionist. That framing for, the PRC's internal audience, but also the external audience globally, whether people believe it or not, is absolutely crucial. That narrative, that information warfare that they're going to do to frame Taiwan as a provocateur, potentially the United States as a provocateur, is absolutely crucial. Whether, we're all sitting here and we can call a spade and say, okay, yeah, that's really a load of crap because you guys are starting a blockade and it's really your fault if it escalates. For Beijing, it's absolutely crucial that they frame that correctly. That's, what the lawfare largely is for, so they can frame this in that way. Um, but back to your subsequent question, what we've seen in the exercises is an effort to, have the China Coast Guard and maritime law enforcement operate independently to do simulated interdictions. They've done it with the support of the PLA Navy. They've done it with the support of the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force. And so I think very likely what we would see is a very complex combination of those things, but developed in such a way that the PLA Navy can, as you said, adjust if this does escalate rapidly and they decide, okay, well, a blockade clearly isn't going to work here. We have to switch to a joint island landing campaign and actually invade Taiwan. The PLA Navy needs to maintain enough flexibility and operational capacity to adjust from a blockade to a combination counter-intervention blockade or to an amphibious assault posture and a blockade at the same time. And freeing up space really is what the job of the maritime law enforcement entities will be in that situation.
If I may jump in and, also ask this to everybody, like, really, what is the full benefit of China having or framing itself as having the moral upper hand in this situation? I know that, when it comes to a lot of the justification that China has had for years on the invasion of Taiwan, it has usually been centered around like reuniting China, its long battle, the real conclusion of the revolution, whatever you want to say it, but having this so-called moral upper hand when it comes to addressing the actual invasion, or turning the blockade into actions for an invasion, would that really change anything? Like at the end of the day, is that going to change the response that Taiwan, the United States, or any of our allies are going to have to addressing the invasion? Is it really going to change how Taiwan, is if the invasion is successful, is integrated? Because I really see that even if China has any justification or frames to have any justification for it, it's not going to change the actual procedure of the invasion or how they're going to properly eventually occupy the island if they do end up getting into landings. And I want to ask, like, do we see any big change coming from that?
I think we absolutely could, in a couple ways. First and foremost, in Taiwan, there will be, the effort will be to whatever percentage of Taiwan's population that can be convinced that it's their government's fault, that they're about to suffer under a blockade or an invasion. Um, that effort is crucial. And they do that as much in peacetime as they would in wartime, right? So, for example, narratives claiming that, President Lai's provocations have brought on PLA exercises that were likely planned far in advance of anything President Lai said or didn't say. Uh, Likewise, in the United States or in Europe, the goal is to create an alternative narrative to what the Western narrative is going to be, which is that this is a provocative action, this is destabilizing. China is doing this because it seeks regional hegemony or whatever the argument will be. They need to have an alternative narrative because there are elements of any society that has the ability to pick your own opinion. There are going to be people that agree with it, and that could create upward facing pressure on US politicians, on European politicians, on Japanese politicians or Australians, whoever. That would be the goal. How successful it will be, I have no idea, but they invest very significant, really incredible amounts of resources to creating an alternative information environment that promotes the PRC's the party line on a given issue, right? The Global Times exists exclusively for that reason, as does, the many kind of influencers and travel bloggers that, are at face just people who travel to China and just happen to go to Xinjiang, for example. Like that effort is top to bottom propaganda that the PRC takes incredibly seriously, and they've had success in doing that. So I think that would be the goal, and I do think there is a possibility that it would have an impact across the board.
I think it's also important internally, just in terms of their own framework. It would ease domestic mobilization, and I think it's really about controlling the escalation ladder because if other countries that are supporting Taiwan come in too strongly, then others might see this as a overreaction or exerting unnecessary force. And whether we like it or not, China is gaining influence on the world stage.
There's There is a thing that I want to talk about later on the in this episode that a lot of you guys are talking about and focusing on in kind of this and that internal domestic thing, and it ties back to the previous China episode that we talked about the purges. But I'm going to pause that because I'll bring it up later because I'm seeing a kind of a theme there that I think is very important to highlight. But I want to move on from kind of this aspect, and we kind of already highlighted the kind of the complexity of it, right? Of just a blockade which in the grand scheme of thing, it's kind of the low risk, low reward that China can kind of institute this without, and hopefully from that perspective, the escalation management, where I think is very important. That's why they would take a course of action like this. Where I think the risk also happens is, if the blockade, let's say, ends because of diplomatic pressures, let's say there's not even a military component or there's heightened tensions, the international community gets involved, sanctions are levied, et cetera, against China and all that, but maybe we don't get to a situation of war. If, let's say, diplomacy wins and it kind of goes, back to before. I mean, China has already left all this card on the table. You're inviting a scenario where the United States, Taiwan, and Japan, and Australia, and even maybe even NATO as a whole, from a European construct, might be much more vested and involved in Taiwan because of understanding the risk if China seizes Taiwan, how that would transform the geopolitical scenario in the Indo-Pacific. So, I really think that this is a very important conversation because the blockade aspect. Once China lets its cards out, it's you lost the element, not necessarily a surprise, but now you've already gone full blown. You have to go it. So under that construct, let's continue this war game, and let's say out the next scenario. Let's say China, because you can analyze this war game in two different ways. You can either do it an isolated event from a blockade, seizing an outer island, or going full blown invasion against Taiwan proper. Or maybe within the escalation matter, they do one, one, and one, right? First, they start with the blockade. They don't achieve their objectives through the blockade. Okay, well, now they want to go to the next step. And let's say it's seizing one of these outer islands of and Taiwan, because there is a lot of islands like that, and some of them right there where they're right next to China, significant civilian population, and it's an easier target for China to seize. And I think there's a lot of these that even have a lot of civilian, a lot of civilian population that would give kind of maybe China an opportunity to leverage seeding these outer islands as an opportunity to then use it as a way to say, okay, now we're operating from a scenario of strength, similar to let's call it Crimea. If we're going to look at Russia, Ukraine, seizing an island might be like Crimea, seize a small territory. Use that for political and geopolitical negotiations and leverage for your ultimate goal of reunification. So, Ben, let me ask you this. If China decides, as there's a lot of outlying islands that Taiwan controls, either from the South China Sea or they're right next to China, some of them uninhabited, some of them inhabited. If China makes a decision of seizing one of these islands and not necessarily Taiwan, which is the most likely one you think they would? And would they do one of the more populated ones, one of the more, let's say, not so populated? How would they do it? And what do you think they would try to gain as leverage? And let's call this medium risk, medium reward. So, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. Taiwan's outlying islands. I mean, I spent some time in Jinmen, and from the Airbnb I was staying at, I could walk to the beach and physically see China. Right, you can't get closer than that. So, I think um, Jinmen probably would be like it's the closest of all of them. It poses a risk to Xiamen, with the number of Taiwan forces that are deployed there. I think the there's a significant risk, in my opinion, to launching a limited operation to seize the outlying islands, rather than doing it as part of a broader operation to take Taiwan entirely. And that is, you don't know how the international community and Taiwan are going to react to that, really. You can never really predict that. And so the big concern for PLA planners is, if you are assuming, which they have to, the United States is going to intervene against you, it's going to take time for the United States to muster the forces and capabilities necessary to really make a wholehearted effort to do that. And so, as a result of that, the more time you spend sitting in a blockade posture, for example, and not achieving a goal, or expending forces and material and time to seize the outlying islands, I don't know how long it would take. It probably wouldn't take very long, but they're fairly well fortified. There are a lot of forces deployed there. Um, that time you spend is time that the United States can muster its forces into the region, however many carrier groups, however many deployments of aircraft from other theaters to air bases in, Japan and Guam and other parts of the Pacific. Um, it provides a significant risk because if you then have to transition from one of those blockade or a limited island seizure, you might be fighting against an intervention that is much better prepared than if you had just gone for the full thing from the start. So I think that is the kind of detriment to doing it. I think it's well within their capacity to do. I really, I think it could be, as you said, politically, like very beneficial in terms of the populations that live there. They are generally not, DPP leaning, right? These are not Taiwan sovereignty and democracy's biggest fans. Not that they don't like it. It's just, it's not where they lean. And so I think, for example, when I was in Jinmen, I was there for 2.5 days, and it's a small island, so I was just kind of carting around. And I was asking people like, "Hey, so are you worried about this? You guys got invaded a couple times before during the Cold War. They have all kinds of monuments for it. There are old tanks still on the beach that you can go and take pictures with, all kinds of museums." And everyone basically said the same thing to me, which was, "No, we're not worried about it. Take the ferry to Xiamen. It's 15 minutes. Those are our brothers. They're not going to attack us." Right? And so for those folks, a transition from governance under Taiwan, which is further away than China, could be, a little bit easier to stomach. Can't say for sure, but I think that's politically an opportunity for Beijing. I think it's unlikely, however, that potential opportunity outweighs the risk of, okay, how do people react if we do this and we still don't get a major concession from Taipei and we have to adjust now to a full-scale invasion? What are we going to be dealing with, in that situation after having spent this time launching a limited joint island landing campaign?
So I'll go to Michael right now, but so Ben, I actually have a question though. So is there based on the scenario you brought up, is there a possibility then that instead of a major, because how I framed this was that if there was a season out of island, then it would be a declared named operation and significant military force. And I agree with you, right? There's a significant amount of risk because you're inviting that's it, you lost everything and you're inviting the US can muster and respond. But from that, the way you presented it, is there maybe a possibility of kind of like a little green men scenario where you instigate you create a false pretext of political upheaval, and then you send little green men over there, or you do it much more covertly, much more, et cetera. You try to frame it differently. Does that fall within a realm of possibility, or would it still be? It would have to be much more overt, Chinese military operation to do something at this magnitude.
I think given the nature of the operations and what we're talking about, it would be very hard to hide. And I think that as a result of that, the risks of you're also giving Taiwan the chance to get onto war footing and disperse its missile systems and move its leadership to hardened bunkers and like that window of opportunity for example, a decapitation strike could vanish if you are limiting the scope of your operation into just the outlying islands. So I think from my perspective, I think it's highly unlikely that a limited seizure of the outlying islands would be a step that Beijing would take at this point.
To step in, I gotta agree with you on that point, Ben. I really do think that, any attempts to take these outlying islands are going to come with the, side effect that it basically warns all Taiwan and all of Taiwan's allies that like the a larger strike could be coming, more defenses and really, kind of decapitates any possibility of, a full-scale invasion of Taiwan being successful. In my opinion, though, I do think that just an outright seizure of the islands would create a long-scale diplomatic incident. But in my opinion, as we've seen a lot of diplomatic incidents happening within the past, decade or so, there really hasn't been a very harsh, open response that could, in my opinion, make Beijing return these islands. I think if that's something that they did, they most likely would be holding on to these islands and probably just create more global global tension, but then the next day everybody would just move on to what we were doing, whatever we were doing the day previously. I think that in that's definitely not how Beijing has, said. They have said for a while that their full intentions are an invasion of the islands, and I don't really think they'd be able to frame just taking the outlying islands as a victory or as a, big strategic step. They could really, I feel like the public and everybody else would just see it as the first step, and now we're just waiting for the next shoe to drop, and that leaves nobody happy, really, in the end, especially, whoever China's trying to convince that this invasion is justified.
I completely agree. I think it's important to just throw in at this point that, we're operating under a scenario where the PRC, that Xi Jinping has decided that military action is the only course. And I think it's just important to throw out there that, Beijing has repeatedly and continues to repeatedly assert that a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan question, is the desired outcome, right? So they're developing the forces necessary to deal with the scenario where it's not, and that's what we're talking about now. But I think it's just important to lay out. There's no there's no deadline for an invasion. We're not talking about, oh, it's January 1st, 2027. Here come the missiles. I think the transition from what Beijing is saying now and what it has been saying for 70 plus years, or 50 plus years, which is we want to negotiate our way out of this. We want to have a settlement where we don't have to fight over it because we know it's going to be ugly, and we're hoping that we can work with the other side of the strait. Obviously, they haven't been willing to talk to DPP, but there's an election in Taiwan in 2028. The KMT could win. They control the parliament right now through coalition, so it's not out of the question. So I think with that transition, right, the calculus will be, okay, well, if we figured out, if we decided or we've assessed that there's no way we're going to negotiate our way out of this, it seems to me that the most logical step to accomplishing the objective, which is to, unify Taiwan into the PRC in some manner, is to take the course of action that provides the highest chance of success and the least amount of opportunities for a spoiler like the United States to mess up your whole operation. And so for me, I think I come down in the camp of, if you're going to do it, you have to do it all the way. And that's like a rapid, high intensity, high tempo invasion operation that I know we're going to cover subsequently, but I just wanted to kind of frame my thoughts on that.
Well, just to step in here, Ben, just to poke fun a little bit, I absolutely agree with you. But like, if we really track what China's been saying for the past 70 years, it's basically they've been talking to Taiwan saying, "Hey, we're going to kill you. We prefer not to, but we're going to do it." And any half measures are not going to be appreciated by the Chinese, by the CCP. Is going to ruin their legitimacy. And honestly, I still feel, and I think we all just there's probably just a division in us talking here that really the PRC really lacks the justification, or lacks the PR to like justify this invasion, given what they've been saying for decades at this point, and given the relationship they have with everybody else around them.
And that could change, right? I mean, I completely agree. Like they keep saying, right, the way things are going right now is not good. The government in Taiwan is being provocative. It's run by secessionists and extremists. If that continues, right, they are building the narrative necessary for them to explain why they would launch a Taiwan contingency in whatever form they choose to launch it. But exactly, I mean, they've repeatedly said we want to find a way to deal with this peacefully. But just, they constantly remind us through these exercises, like we are building the capacity to deal with this. If you're not going to work with us, we're gonna work it out ourselves.
And personally, I would just dread to see that if any PRC apologists on Twitter or anything else trying to claim justification for this invasion, like we see those locals LARP for Russia with the Ukraine war. I dread to see it.
Me too.
So, actually, because you said that, and I think this is kind of where this is one of the very interesting scenarios when you're doing kind of war game from like, and again, this is a very strategic, high level kind of war game that we're discussing. This of the different courses of actions that can happen. It appears that we're actually all in some way in agreement that, and it's one of those weird scenarios where the most likely course of action is the most dangerous course of action, which is a full-on invasion of Taiwan directly, because of the risk associated with the involvement of the United States, the involvement of Japan, the ability to muster forces, and it forces, if Xi Jinping orders that we need to seize Taiwan militarily, they will not do it through a blockade. They will not do it from seizing our island. They're going to go straight to the heart They're going to go straight into Taiwan. And the interesting case, actually, one of the crazy scenarios is, if you look at this, is I think a case study would be Ukraine. I think if you're looking at Russia Ukraine from 2014, I think the biggest mistake Vladimir Putin did in 2014 is that he just went for Crimea and the Donbass, and he enabled Ukraine 8 years to build up their military capability, and much more so in coordination with the West. That then, when he made the decision to invade Ukraine directly and seize Kyiv in 2022, he faced a much more ideologically coherent government and much more capable military that halted his plan. And I think how Xi Jinping's thing is, I'm not going to give Taiwan 8 years to do a whole government approach to militarize their society. So I'm going to go big or I'm going to go home. And so that causes an interesting case study where the most likely course of action is the most dangerous course of action, is that they would seize Taiwan directly. And so what I would say, Ben, my question for you is, one, I mean, I think it's clear to say that anything of this magnitude would dwarf D-Day, Operation Overlord of 1944, the U.S. invasion, the Allied invasion of Normandy. It would dwarf it from a capabilities perspective, from a numbers perspective. It would be a logistical nightmare. I mean, this would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. I don't see how this wouldn't be. But if you disagree, by all means, please let me know. But I guess that's the thing. I mean, first, let's go back. Before an invasion is launched, how much time do you think the PLA would need to prepare forces to seize it? And since my assumption is it would be a large invasion force, this isn't something that they can do, surprise sneak attack. I mean, the world would know. We would have probably months of warning before it happens. What do you think, Ben?
Well, that really is the million-dollar question, right? And you're exactly right. A Taiwan contingency operation will be the most complex military operation ever attempted in human history. Nothing will compare in terms of the amphibious assault, which is, the hardest thing to do, combined with, high intensity, long range strike capabilities, information operations, cyber, space. Like, it will be unlike anything we've ever seen. And so, I think how much warning time are we going to have? It really depends on a couple of things. First, and I'll get this one out of the way, is what we saw ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that U.S. intelligence simply knew, and they posted it. It was on the front page of the New York Times, right? A couple weeks before that they were, what the battle plan was going to be. Whether we have that kind of penetration into, the PRC security apparatus and political establishment, I have no idea. But we could. So we could get a ton of warning from that. I think from a practical standpoint, one of the goals of the PRC's kind of whole of government pressure campaign against Taiwan in the last 4 years, 6 years especially, is the kind of muddying of the waters in our ability to assess things about their posture and their potential preparations to launch a Taiwan contingency. And so, with these major exercises, for example, there's going to be more. They will likely be larger and last longer. And so, as you do that, the transition from an exercise posture to an actual operational, like a kinetic operation posture, if you're practicing that exact operation, it's not that difficult to do if that's what you've gone in intending to do. So, there will be signs, right? There'll be, for example, conscript demobilization will have to stop, right? You don't want people's contracts running out while they're on a boat on the way to Taiwan. That's not going to work out for you. There will be, a shift in the military posture kind of nationwide in China because there are concerns, from the PLA that if they start a war in the Taiwan Strait, that perhaps some other situation will arise that will require them to respond militarily elsewhere. For example, the Western Theater Command will have to be ready for some kind of opportunistic escalation by India. Whether that's likely or not, I have no idea, but that's what they think could happen, right? Or a destabilizing event on the Korean Peninsula. The Northern Theater Command is going to have to be ready for that. The Southern Theater Command is going to have to be supporting a Taiwan contingency, but also preparing for, some kind of really provocative action by the Philippines. So we'll see a kind of whole mobilization to some extent that will be unusual. How unusual it will be will depend on how often the PLA practices it before we reach a situation like this. And then there's kind of like the brass tacks signs of preparation that are unusual. So the movement of large amounts of forces to amphibious staging areas, for example, the opening of blood banks, that was a big one for Ukraine. It's like once you open these, you're on the clock. You don't want to waste it. They're expensive to maintain. It takes a long time to replenish them. So I think in the best case scenario, not considering a potential Western or US intelligence decision to say like, hey, we know this is coming, here's the situation. I think the best case scenario will have like 90 days. Worst case, maybe 25 to 30 days. But then that's only a warning for them to adopt a pre-operational posture, which is okay, we're going to send 2 carrier groups to the Western Pacific, and we're going to have another one in the East China Sea, and we're going to deploy, Type 075, amphibious ready groups to the, close by to potential landing sites in Taiwan. We're going to relocate all of our civilian roll on roll off ferries and other military civil fusion assets to where they need to go. The question is, how long can the PRC sit in that posture before they decide, okay, now it's time to go and we're going to fire the missiles, right? So I think we're looking at more of like a tactical operational surprise than a strategic surprise, but it's still very hard to, when we get down to that scenario to gauge, okay, when are they going to hit the button and the missiles are going to start flying?
And I think a lot of that depends on the willingness of the current administration to share that intel. And if there are any gaps that are caused potentially by what we've seen in terms of a bit of discord between Five Eyes, I think that could also be important here.
Absolutely. Um, and then there's, a scenario where they could privately signal to Taipei, the PRC, like, hey, this is it, right? We're here. This is your last chance. Like, come to the table or else it's over. That is a scenario that can't be overlooked as well, because if it's a on-off switch for a massive assault, that provides a lot of leverage to bring someone to the negotiating table. I mean, look no further than the situation in the Middle East right now, right? For an example of that. So, I think that level of warning is also a tool that Beijing will almost certainly employ to try and pressure Taipei away from, or rather towards, some kind of negotiated settlement.
And Ben, I would agree. I mean, I think from a tactical perspective, right, like push the button missiles are flying. Yeah, I mean that's a lot harder. But from a strategic perspective, I mean, we're talking a substantial amount of time. I would even make months, because even if you're having a scenario of constant exercises, there's certain capabilities, as you mentioned, that you cannot have at all points. And again, we're talking about an operation that would involve hundreds of thousands of service members of the Chinese PLA for this type of invasion of Taiwan, if not greater, at some point, right? I mean, we're talking about the first stage of the operation would involve probably 2 components. One, an amphibious, but there would also be an air assault, airdrop type of operation as well, right? Missile strikes, et cetera. So there's this tactical component, but the buildup of all the capabilities, the loading of personnel, and then those abilities of those forces to get sent over to Taiwan, again, it's substantial. And I mean, we're talking about hundreds of kilometers that these guys would have to travel through to the Taiwan Strait. Again, much greater than anything we saw in D-Day. And I think the main limitations that I think that China has in this type of operation is logistics, right? Both from and from ability to sustain forces before they launch, and then while they launch, and then while they land. I think that's going to be the main constraint that they run into, is their ability to do logistical operations and to sustain those forces, especially once they reach Taiwan. Because a lot of the capabilities that, again, this is from a 2027 perspective, as you alluded to, a lot of this would be civilian roll-on, roll-off, which again are not necessarily designed to provide max amount of protections, and there's significant risk of those types of capabilities that would need to be extensively protected by the PLA Navy. And again, so you can have a scenario where the PLA Navy and the Coast Guard are kind of operating around, but the actual forces, from Fujian, let's say, straight over to Taiwan, right, from the Eastern Theater Command to Taiwan, they want to go the quickest route. Those forces that would be involved would require a substantial amount. That's why, from a strategic perspective, I think we would have a lot more warning. The question is, how is that action and how is that decided upon? And do we run into a scenario? How does Taiwan respond? Because we saw in the Ukraine example, Ukraine didn't respond really significantly till the invasion was almost imminent days before. Like they didn't mobilize the country as quickly and with enough anticipation. They kind of pushed this off, and didn't believe in the United States, right? And so that would be an interesting. How does the Taiwan? How does the U.S. Because the U.S. has made it clear, at least we'll see with this administration, how does the U.S. military in the Indo-Pacific and Indo-PACOM respond? And I think those are kind of the aspects. But I think from a strategic perspective, we would have months of anticipation. The question is, how is that leveraged? But go ahead, Michael.
I do think that's a really crucial thing to discuss here is the various factors that are going to play into this invasion because this whole scenario is not just the military capabilities of China versus the military capabilities of Taiwan. There are multiple factors to really consider here. And what I really want to touch on is the the various other nations that are surrounding Taiwan and China, specifically the Philippines and Japan, are going to play a huge role in any potential invasion that happens, even if it's like the low stakes that we talked for the blockade to the high stakes if we just see an immediate attempts at an invasion. Specifically with Japan, with the recent elections we have seen in Japan, with the LDP now commanding like an absolute majority with the capability of changing the constitution, the Prime Minister Takaichi has stated multiple times that her posture towards Taiwan is changing. Japan's posture and like position and how they're going to address China is changing. And that ultimately, we just have to kind of at the moment take them at their word that they are going to ramp up their capabilities militarily. They are going to potentially revoke Article 9, and we're going to see a buildup of Japanese military capabilities. How successful they are is up to up to people's debate, but they are posturing themselves to be involved in this conflict, and how they really play into that conflict really does change the whole scenario itself. Because now you have there's already multiple factors you have to consider to the United States, but now with Japan and the capabilities that they may have in assisting whatever may happening. Well, we also have to consider the Philippines as well with the United States positioning down there. It completely changes the scenario. You go ahead, Ben.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there is significant escalation potential when you start considering who has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, or by extension, intervening on behalf of Taiwan against a PRC invasion. And so, yeah, I think to your point, how will Japan's potential shift politically and subsequently militarily, alter the calculus? That is a massive wild card for Beijing that I think they are very rightly concerned about. And the Philippines as well, right? There's an effort to modernize in the Philippines. Obviously, they have no love lost for Beijing because of the situation in the South China Sea. They attempt to maintain some level of stability there, but there are also a significant number of Filipino overseas workers in Taiwan that are going to be put at significant risk, right? If there's some kind of invasion that could incentivize some kind of at least evacuation operation by Manila. How does Beijing account for that, right? Are you going to let the Philippine armed forces fly helicopters to southern Taiwan and pick up their citizens, or any of the other Southeast Asian countries that have significant populations of overseas workers in Taiwan? Um, who knows? I mean, it's a significant wild card, and it's something that Beijing has been considering for quite some time. I think with the Japanese elections, the Japan and also recent statements from Japanese leadership, they might have to consider the Japan angle a little bit more seriously than perhaps they were before. But yeah, that coupled with what the United States will do, we had a period of relative strategic clarity in the Biden administration, at least from the president, who said, no less than 4 times that the United States would intervene, militarily on behalf of Taiwan. And he made the distinction between Ukraine and Taiwan on that question repeatedly. But President Trump, we're not sure. He's really kind of returned to that pure strategic ambiguity, and it's there's been kind of mixed signals on the Taiwan issue. Obviously, very significant arms sales, but also statements from the president and other, senior members of the administration that might makes some people in Taiwan a little bit nervous about America's potential involvement in a conflict. So, yes, all that to say, I mean, that is, I think, if a Taiwan contingency expands beyond a two-party game, the impact internationally to the global economy, to every around the world will so much more acute. And I think Beijing has to consider that potential very, very, very carefully.
Can I just, every time we talk about Taiwan, and right, there's this idea that, and I'm not saying, Ben, that you agree with this, but there's this construct and there's this framing of the conversation that all China needs to do, right, is either seize Taiwan in a couple of weeks to prevent the United States to respond quickly, right, or to kind of fait accompli before it happens, or if the United States politically says we're not going to get involved, Taiwan is done. And I'm going to be that voice and say that I fundamentally disagree with that assessment. And the reason why I'm going to say I fundamentally disagree with that assessment is simple. We saw, Ukraine received military support and intelligence support and equipment from the West, but again, like not earth-shattering. Specifically in the beginning of the invasion, they were able to halt Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And this was a land invasion, significantly easier. I think people are underestimating the absolute nightmare of an operation this will be for any PLA planner. And I think it is not being taken seriously how hard of an operation this is. And I think this idea that unless the US responds, Taiwan is doomed is, in my perspective, and again, not saying, Ben, that that's your philosophy or your opinion. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. And we can run into a situation just like Russia, Ukraine, where the Chinese thinks, hey, we're going to seize it. And after the first 72 hours, the United States sees the situation on the ground in Taiwan, sees how disastrous it is for the PLA, and they might just say, you know what, let's not get involved. Why run the risk of a World War III type of scenario if China is not even having an opportunity to seize a beachhead, or if they seize a beachhead, they're unable to sustain their forces significantly to push further into Taiwan? Again, Taiwan is a major, even though it's a huge island with mountains, et cetera, it's a major urban population. Again, this would dwarf D-Day, and that was a nightmare from a perspective from a military operation. But Ben, I'll go to you, and then I'll go to Michael. Go ahead, Ben.
I think you're exactly right. I do think there is a kind of unfair default to be like, okay, well, if Taiwan doesn't have outside help, they're like totally done for. Um, I think that, and to your point, right, the geography is Taiwan's really greatest defensive asset, right? They have to cross water and they have to deal with densely populated cities and massive mountain ranges, and bad weather, like for most of the year, and poor sea conditions. That all makes it very difficult. And so there are scenarios that are, I think, very realistic where the PLA fails to accomplish the necessary, steps to successfully invade the island. Um, I think from the reason why I am always focused on, a potential U.S. intervention is because that is what the PLA is, beyond what they admit is a very difficult problem in launching an invasion of Taiwan. They also have to contend with a potential U.S. intervention. And so that how they've developed their force, how they've developed their doctrine, and what capabilities that they're investing in reflect that assumption that we have to be ready for the United States to get involved. But you're exactly right. It is sustainment is a nightmare, right? And if you don't sustain your forces and they land, even if you get a lodgment and they get wiped out because they run out of ammunition, then what was the point, right? You've lost. Um, and to Taiwan's credit, they are taking steps to complicate the ability of the PLA to do that. Now, to be fair, Taiwan also has been dealing with a lot of structural and institutional difficulties in modernizing its forces, modernizing how its forces operate, most importantly. Um, and so I think nuance is very much necessary because it is very difficult as an operation for the PLA. They obviously have no combat experience since 1979, uh, but Taiwan doesn't either. And so, you know, there are it's almost a race to readiness in a way between the two sides, where it's like Taiwan is really prioritizing, expanding its defense capacity indigenizing the development of, asymmetric capabilities, importing bespoke capabilities from the United States. Uh, Whether you agree with what kind of capabilities they're importing is a whole other question. But, I think to your point, you're exactly right. They could easily, under certain circumstances, win on their own. I think it's safer, in my opinion, to assume that the PLA is going to get ready enough to be able to do it against Taiwan alone because of the asymmetries in the PLA's favor. And I think they are working very diligently and frankly with great success at identifying where the gaps in their capabilities are, specifically the logistical capabilities, and filling those either through military civil fusion or at the same time, they're rapidly expanding their replenishment fleet as well. So I think it's very good to give Taiwan credit where credit is due and recognize that how difficult this is going to be. But at the same time, the PLA sees this as well. And so I think it's also crucial to recognize that like the more time that passes, we're looking at a year from now, but if we're talking about 2 or 3 years from now in a hypothetical invasion scenario, the PLA is going to look very different than it does today.
If I may step in and say a bit here, is that I believe that's absolutely correct. When we're considering the actual invasion, with or without the United States involved, China has to secure some just very basic things. Like they have to, if they want a naval landing, they have to secure beachheads, and the only places to do that are in the north and the south. And the north is the more like more urban sprawl had more urban conflict down there. So, it's quite possible that the South is more of a likely destination. But even then, securing that kind of beachhead and then basically working your way up through the entirety of the island, a very mountainous island on top of that, there is various logistic hurdles that China has to overcome with or without the United States involved. Yeah, and I believe that Taiwan is aware of that, and Taiwan is preparing its armed forces, uh, its potential for the fact that if this invasion happens, how they're going to defend the main island itself. Even if we saw a quick landing, and China was able to secure those, we fall into the possibility that this is going to become a long drawn out conflict, and I do not think that is something that China can afford. That's not something that This is not an invasion that like time is on their side, and we can't. While it's not an exact one for one, Taiwan isn't Ukraine, and Taiwan cannot become Ukraine, especially for China's anything in China's benefit. As we've seen with Russia, like as long as this conflict is ongoing, it's just deplete. It's just a depletion of Russia's resources and Russia's justification for what it's doing. And again, like I said, while it's not a same one for one, we're falling into very similar situations where this cannot be a kind of drawn out battle. But unfortunately, given even if the United States is in it, it might devolve into that.
Absolutely. And I think just to your point, the international economic impact of a war in the Taiwan Strait is just infinitely more dangerous for the PRC than it is even for Russia and Ukraine. And, look at how the Russian economy is doing and multiply that by, some inordinate number. That's what you're looking at, not only for the Chinese economy, for the global economy. So absolutely, there's an incentive to get this done as quickly as possible.
So I guess the last question I would have for you is we've recently seen purges, and we spoke about this 2 weeks ago, but these purges within the Chinese Military Commission. And we see sort of this degradation of military experience over political preference within the Chinese Communist Party and especially the Military Commission. So, Ben, do you think that some of this is being driven by assessments that have been made that have been trying to push that 2027 goal? And what do you think the larger implication is of these purges?
Well, I'd like to start with a caveat, and forgive me. I will say that my perspective when it comes to the political nature of these purges is that nobody really knows, right? Except the people involved and probably hopefully the White House. I think fundamentally, regardless of why the purges have taken place, whether it's really just pure corruption or it's factionalism and Xi Jinping assessing that, oh, maybe Zhang Yusha is a little bit too popular right now because I've purged all these other people. Um, I think fundamentally what it represents is the removal of institutional limits on his ability to use force. And I think that should be, for me at least, that was the biggest takeaway for, the concerning angle of it. Which is, in 2027 or 2028 or whenever, if Xi Jinping is like, okay, well, I think it's time to go on Taiwan or on the Philippines or on Japan, if he has one other guy on the Central Military Commission who he has, put there, and he's purged everybody else, who's going to tell him no? And so that I think is very problematic for everybody, including China, right? Xi Jinping is not a young man, and so if in 5 or 6 years, if he's not as lucid as he is right now, and he wants to go to war and try and secure his legacy as the guy who brought Taiwan back into China, if that's the way you see it, uh, and no one's and the military side is going to tell him no, that's very dangerous for you because your forces may not be prepared to do such a complex operation. So that's my biggest takeaway from the purges. I know there's been a lot of great analysis done on potential reasons why, people reading into the PLA daily editorials and the kind of language that's used. I think that's all fantastic work. I frankly I tend to avoid that kind of thing because I just think it's almost impossible for us to know unless somebody who is involved tells you outright.
I think, Ben, we talked about this in the previous episode. One of the aspects, we kind of discussed a lot wide range issues, and kind of my focus was more on kind of the paranoia of Xi Jinping. But I think what you bring up is exactly the point of how you framed it, which is, is Xi Jinping going to be the general of everything? And if there's an invasion of Taiwan, is there the plan then that he is the Eastern Theater commander? He's the Joint Chiefs commander, like he's the commander of everything, and he's going to direct the operation from the top, because right now his command infrastructure has been such gutted in a way that kind of leaves open that questions. But that other point that I brought up in the past when we were starting recording this, that's what I wanted to bring up now. That I'll bring up here at this moment. I think there's also a mindset within Xi Jinping that he's trying to get to the country into a mindset willing to sacrifice much more for his objective of getting China to kind of this great power status, right? And I think Taiwan is a piece of that puzzle. I think it's a critical piece of that puzzle. It's not the only piece, but I think it's a critical piece. But I think in his mind, I think it goes back to that earlier conversation of like this justification inside of China and doing that. I think it also has to be expanded into other areas, like how much pain can the Chinese people endure for such a military operation, both militarily and economically, right? And even just politically, right? Because China would be shut out of the international community much more so than we see in Russia. And I think Xi Jinping's mindset is, and this is something, if you kind of look at his economic policy and why he hates consumerism and why he has tried to not focus on consumerism from an economic perspective, even though that would make more sense, it's because I think in his perspective, it's kind of make this bourgeois, lazy population, and that's not what he wants. And he wants a population willing to endure extreme pains, similar to Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward, right, and this Cultural Revolution to get China to the next level. I think that's his mindset. And I think there's something in Xi Jinping's own idea. There's not only necessarily the military component, can the militarily seize it? I don't know if Xi Jinping believes that the society is willing to endure much pain. And that's why we see this huge range of authoritarianism and this mass imposition of ideology, kind of reminiscence of Mao, because he wants the society to be able to endure so much pain so that it never has any domestic constraints or opposition to a military opposition in Taiwan. I think the purges are more, and I said this in the previous episode, and there's been some reporting that said, I think it's more related to his paranoia, but that's a separate aspect. And I think that is what's the biggest focus is Xi Jinping, is he concerned that the Chinese population might say, hey, we don't want this invasion. We don't want to suffer economically. We don't want to cancel our travel, especially the higher net worth individuals, right? And you cannot discount the international reach that China has now since the 21st century, right? I mean, there's Chinese diasporas all around the world, and how would they feel of being completely cut off? And I think that's something that Xi Jinping has really been trying to focus on, as well as from the military component. There's much more that I think he needs to do inside of the country before he takes that step.
I think it's very well said. I think, yeah, there is definitely an institutional effort led by Xi Jinping to, prepare the Chinese people for what will be a high cost operation, even if it goes really well. I think an example I point to is I think it was in 2024, maybe late 2023, when the PLA put out a series of documentary episodes and about different angles of their force and development. And one of the kind of vignettes that they highlighted was they interviewed deep sea or undersea mine defusal teams. These guys who go in and try and manually defuse naval mines. And essentially, one of the guys was like, "Well, we're going to do our best to, defuse these mines, but if we can't defuse them with machines, we're just going to activate them with our bodies and blow ourselves up so the ships can, go over safely." And that's that's pretty extreme rhetoric, right? To be pushing out on a national scale about your armed forces, right? You're talking about sacrifice operations to facilitate an invasion. And so I think you're absolutely right. There is an effort to prepare, the Chinese people for the cost that will be imposed upon them in the situation. And I think, how successful that will be and how that could impact a timetable, if one exists, of when an invasion, could or would take place is very interesting to think about.
Well, Ben, I want to take this opportunity to thank you again for joining us again in the bottom line up front. This has been a phenomenal conversation, something kind of a different format. Generally focused on the geopolitical news, and we try to kind of look at the best, but this is something much more forward-looking and much more of an analytical debate. And war game, and it's something that I think we did a very good job, and I think we laid out all the different scenarios. And I think a lot of us gained a lot from this conversation. It does look like how we view this is the most likely course of action is the most dangerous course of action. And so if this is 2027 and Xi Jinping decides to launch an invasion of Taiwan, the PLA is going to go big because they understand that they have to go high risk, high reward because everything else invites Taiwan or the United States or Japan or others to take the initiative away from them. But Ben, as always, this has been a phenomenal conversation. We'll make sure to share all your profiles and your socials. You do great work, and I'm really, really thankful that you are our lead guest for this conversation. So with that, I want to thank all my speakers here and my listeners for listening in. This has been the bottom line up front, and we'll see you soon.